Tonight's lecture is over Chapter 27, Fluid, Electrolyte, and Acid-Base Homeostasis, and this chapter begins on page 1087 in your textbook. Regulating the volume and composition of body fluids, controlling their distribution throughout the body, and balancing the pH of body fluids are crucial to maintaining the overall homeostasis and health of a person. A body fluid is a substance, usually a liquid, that is produced by the body and consists of water and dissolved solutes. In lean adults, body fluids constitute between 55 and 60% of the total body mass in males and females respectively. Body fluids are present in two main compartments, and those compartments are inside of the cells and outside of the cells. About 2/3 of the body fluid is what we call intracellular fluid, and that is located within the cells. The other third of body fluids is called extracellular fluid, and this is located outside of the cells, and it includes all other body fluids. About 80% of the extracellular body fluid is interstitial, which occupies the microscopic spaces between tissue cells, and 20% of the extracellular fluid is blood plasma, the liquid portion of blood. Other extracellular fluids that are grouped with interstitial fluid include the lymph plasma in the lymphatic vessels, the cerebral spinal fluid in the nervous system, the synovial fluid in the joints, the aqueous humor and vitreous body in the eyes, endolymph and perilymph in the ears, and the pleural, pericardial, and peritoneal fluids between the serous membranes. So this cartoon is on page 1088, and this is figure 27.1. And this shows the distribution of solids and fluids in an average lean adult female and male. So you can see that the female has less fluid but more solid, and the male has more fluid and less solid. The plasma membrane of individual cells separates intracellular fluid from the surrounding interstitial fluid. It allows some substances to cross but blocks the movement of other substances. In addition, active transport pumps work continuously to maintain different concentration of certain ions in the cytosol and interstitial fluid. Concerning the blood vessel walls, they divide the interstitial fluid from the blood plasma. Only in capillaries, the smallest blood vessels, are the walls thin enough and leaky enough to permit the exchange of water and solutes between the blood plasma and the interstitial fluid. And this cartoon takes us back to page 1088, figure 27.1, and it's just showing the exchange of water among body fluid compartments. The process of filtration, reabsorption, diffusion, and osmosis allow the continual exchange of water and solutes among body fluid compartments. Yet the volume of fluid in each compartment remains remarkably stable. As you will recall, the pressures that promote filtration from fluid from blood capillaries and reabsorption of fluid back into capillaries is called blood hydrostatic pressure. Because osmosis is the primary means of water movement between the intracellular fluid and the interstitial fluid, the concentration of solutes in these fluids determines the direction of water movement. Most of the solutes in the body fluids are electrolytes. Fluid balance is closely related to electrolyte balance. Electrolytes are inorganic compounds that dissociate into ions. Because the intake of water and electrolytes rarely occurs in exactly the same proportions as their presence in body fluids, the ability of the kidneys to excrete excess water by producing dilute urine or to excrete excess electrolytes by producing concentrated urine is of the utmost importance in the maintenance of homeostasis. The body can gain water by ingestion and by metabolic synthesis. The main sources of body water are ingested liquids and moist foods, and these are absorbed from the digestive canal. The other source of water is metabolic water that is produced in the body mainly when electrons are accepted by oxygen during aerobic respiration, and to a smaller extent during dehydration synthesis reactions. Normally, body fluid volume remains constant because water loss equals water gain. Water loss occurs in 4 ways, and those 4 ways include urination, perspiration, exhalation, and defecation. This cartoon is on page 1089, and this is figure 27.2, and this just shows the sources of daily water gain and loss under normal condition. So normally, daily water loss equals daily water gain. Moving on to the next slide, the volume of metabolic water formed in the body depends entirely on the level of aerobic respiration, which reflects the demand for ATP in the body cells. When more ATP is produced, more water is formed. Bodily water gain is regulated mainly by the volume of water intake or how much fluid you drink. The thirst center in the hypothalamus governs the urge to drink. When water loss is greater than water gain, we call this dehydration. Dehydration is a decrease in the volume and an increase in the osmolarity of body fluids. A decrease in blood volume causes blood pressure to fall. So this next flow diagram on page 1090, figure 27.3, shows the pathways involved in the thirst response. A major stimulus that promotes the sensation of thirst is an increase in the osmolarity of bodily fluids. Increased activity from osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus, triggered by an increase in blood osmolarity, stimulates the thirst center in the hypothalamus. Other signals that stimulate the thirst center come from volume receptors in the atria that detect the decrease in blood volume, baroreceptors in the blood vessels that detect the decrease in blood pressure, angiotensin II that is formed due to the activation of the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone pathway by a decrease in blood pressure, and by neurons in the mouth that detect dryness due to the decreased flow of saliva. As a result of these stimuli, the sensation of thirst increases, which usually leads to increased fluid intake, as long as the fluids are available, and then the restoration of normal fluid volume can occur. Overall, fluid gain should balance fluid loss. Sometimes, though, the sensation of thirst does not occur quickly enough or access to fluids is restricted, and then significant dehydration ensues. This happens most often in elderly people, infants, and those who are in a confused mental state. When heavy sweating or fluid loss from diarrhea or vomiting occurs, it is wise to start replacing the body fluids by drinking fluids even before the sensation of thirst begins. Moving on to the next slide, even though the loss of water and solutes through sweating and exhalation increases during exercise, the elimination of excess body water or solutes occurs mainly by control of their loss in urine. The extent of urinary salt loss is the main factor that determines the body fluid volume. The reason for this is that water follows solutes in osmosis, and the 2 main solutes in the extracellular fluid and in urine are sodium ions and chloride ions. In a similar way, The main factor that determines body fluid osmolarity is the extent of urinary water loss. Moving on to the next slide, there are three major hormones that control the renal sodium ions and chloride ions. Angiotensin II causes increases in blood pressure, influences renal tubuli to retain sodium and water, and it also stimulates aldosterone release from the adrenal gland. Speaking of aldosterone, when there is a decrease in blood pressure, which occurs in response to a decrease in blood volume, or when there is a deficiency in sodium ions in the blood plasma, the kidneys release renin, which activates the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone pathway. Once aldosterone is formed, it increases sodium ion reabsorption in the late distal tubules and collecting ducts of the kidneys, which relieves the sodium ion deficiency in the blood plasma. Because antidiuretic hormone is also released when blood pressure is low, water reabsorption accompanies sodium ion reabsorption via osmosis. This conserves the body fluids by reducing urinary loss of water. And when there is an increase in blood volume, as might occur after you drink a lot of water, this stretches the atria of the heart and promotes the release of atrionatriuretic peptide, or ANP. ANP promotes natriuresis, an elevated excretion of sodium ions into the urine. The osmotic consequence of excreting more sodium ions is the loss of more water in urine, which decreases blood volume and blood pressure. In addition to stimulating the release of ANP, an increase in blood volume also slows the release of renin from the kidneys. When the renin level declines, less aldosterone is formed, which causes the reabsorption of filtered sodium ions to slow in the late distal tubules and collecting ducts of the kidneys. More filtered sodium ions and water thus remain in the tubular fluid to be excreted in the urine. And the major hormone that regulates water loss is antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. This hormone is produced by neurosecretory cells in the hypothalamus and stored in the posterior pituitary gland. When the osmolarity of body fluids increases, osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus not only stimulate thirst, they also increase the synthesis of ADH. ADH promotes the insertion of water channel proteins into the apical membranes of principal cells in the late distal tubules and collecting ducts of the kidneys. As a result, the permeability of these cells to water increases. Water molecules move by osmosis from the renal tubular fluid into the cells and then from the cells into the bloodstream. This results in a decrease in blood osmolarity and an increase in blood volume and blood pressure and the production of a small volume of concentrated urine. Once the body has adequate water, the ADH level in the bloodstream decreases. As the amount of ADH in the blood declines, some of the aquaporin II channels are removed from the apical membrane via endocytosis. Consequently, the water permeability of the principal cells decreases and more water is lost in the urine. And this is figure 27.4 on page 1091, and this shows the role of ADH in water balance. Also, factors other than blood osmolarity influence ADH secretion. A decrease in blood volume or blood pressure also stimulates ADH release. Furthermore, the atrial volume receptors in the atria of the heart detect the decrease in blood volume, and the baroreceptors in blood vessels detect the decrease in blood pressure. ADH release is also stimulated by factors that are unrelated to water balance, such as pain, nausea, and stress. The secretion of ADH is inhibited by alcohol, which is why consumption of alcoholic beverages promotes diuresis. Diuresis means voiding large amounts of urine. And this flow diagram is outlined on page 1092, figure 27.5, and this shows the role of aldosterone in sodium balance. So aldosterone increases the amount of sodium ion reabsorption in the kidneys. And this figure is also on page 1092. This is figure 27.6. This flow diagram shows the role of atrial natriuretic peptide in sodium balance. ANP increases the excretion of sodium ions into the urine. This is called natriuresis. And this table is found on page 1093. This is table 27.1. So this summarizes the factors that maintain body water balance. Please review this table on your own time. And this slide is a continuation of the same table. Please review it on your own time. Moving on to the next slide. Normally the cells of the body neither shrink nor swell because the extracellular fluid that surrounds them is isotonic. This means that the intracellular fluid and the extracellular fluid have the same osmolarity. However, changes in the osmolarity of the extracellular fluid cause fluid imbalances. If extracellular fluid becomes hypertonic, in other words, it has a greater concentration of solutes than the intracellular fluid because its osmolarity has increased, water moves from the cells into the extracellular fluid by osmosis, and this causes the cells to shrink. On the other hand, if the extracellular fluid becomes hypotonic, in other words, it has a lower concentration of solutes than the intracellular fluid because its osmolarity has decreased, then water moves from the extracellular fluid into the cells by osmosis, causing the cells to swell. So changes in osmolarity most often result from changes in the concentration of sodium ions and chloride ions. So the gist of it is that when changes in the osmolarity of the extracellular fluid occurs, as in the case of dehydration or overhydration, this can cause the cells in the body to swell or to shrink. Moving on to the next slide. Water intoxication occurs when excess body water causes the cells to swell dangerously. This may occur when a person consumes water faster than the kidneys can excrete it. And this particular flow diagram is figure 27.7 on page 1093, and this just shows the series of events in water intoxication. Moving on to the next slide, the ions formed when electrolytes dissolve and dissociate serve 4 general functions in the body. It controls the osmosis of water between fluid compartments. It helps maintain the acid-base balance. It helps to carry electrical current. And it serves as several cofactors. As you recall from basic biology, cofactors are needed for optimal enzyme activities. So to compare the charge carried by ions in different solutions, the concentration of ions is typically expressed in units of milliequivalents per liter. Blood plasma, interstitial fluid, and intracellular fluid have different concentrations of electrolytes and protein ions. While the blood plasma contains many protein ions, interstitial fluid only contains a few. And this figure is 27.8 on page 1094. And this shows the electrolyte and protein anion concentrations in blood plasma, interstitial fluid, and intracellular fluid. The height of each column represents milliequivalents per liter. The chief difference between the two extracellular fluids, blood plasma and interstitial fluid, is that blood plasma contains many protein anions in contrast to interstitial fluid, which has very few. This is because normal capillary membranes are virtually impermeable to proteins, and only a few plasma proteins leak out of the blood vessels into the interstitial fluid. This difference in protein concentration is largely responsible for the blood colloid osmotic pressure exerted by blood plasma. In other respects, these two fluids are very similar. The electrolyte content of intracellular fluid differs considerably from that of extracellular fluid. In extracellular fluid, the most abundant cation is sodium ions, and the most abundant anion is chloride ions. In intercellular fluid, however, the most abundant cation is potassium ions, and the most abundant anions are proteins and phosphates. By actively transporting sodium ions out of the cells and potassium ions into the cells, sodium-potassium pumps play a major role in maintaining the high intracellular concentration of potassium ions and the high extracellular concentration of sodium ions. Moving on to the next slide. Sodium ions are the most abundant ions in the extracellular fluid, accounting for 90% of the extracellular cations. The flow of sodium ions through voltage-gated channels in the plasma membrane is also necessary for the generation and conduction of action potentials in neurons and muscle fibers. The sodium ion level is controlled by aldosterone, antidiuretic hormone, and antinatriuretic hormone. Chloride ions are the most prevalent anions in the extracellular fluid. Chloride ions help regulate osmotic pressure between compartments. Because most plasma membranes contain many chloride ion leakage channels and antiporters. Chloride ions are also part of the hydrochloric acid secreted into gastric juice. Antidiuretic hormone helps regulate chloride ion balance in body fluids because it governs the extent of water loss in urine. Processes that increase or decrease renal reabsorption of sodium ions also affect the reabsorption of chloride ions. Moving on to the next slide. Potassium ions are the most abundant cations in the intracellular fluid. Potassium ions play a key role in establishing the resting membrane potential in the repolarization phase of action potentials in neurons and muscle fibers. Furthermore, potassium ions also help maintain normal intracellular fluid volume. When potassium ions move into or out of cells, it is often exchanged for hydrogen ions, and thereby it helps regulate the pH of body fluids. When blood plasma potassium ion concentration is high, more aldosterone is secreted into the blood. Aldosterone then stimulates the principal cells of the renal collecting ducts to secrete more potassium ions, so excess potassium ions are lost in the urine. Conversely, when blood plasma potassium ions concentration is low, aldosterone secretion decreases and less potassium ions are excreted in the urine. Because potassium ions are needed during the repolarization phase of nerve impulses, abnormal potassium ion levels can be lethal. Because such a large amount of calcium is stored in the bone, it is the most abundant mineral in the body. About 98% of the calcium in adults is located in the skeleton and in the teeth, where it is combined with phosphates to form a crystal lattice of mineral salts. In body fluids, calcium is mainly an extracellular cation. Besides contributing to the hardness of bones and teeth, calcium ions play an important role in blood clotting, neurotransmitter release, the maintenance of muscle tone, and the excitability of nervous and muscle tissue. The most important regulator of calcium ion concentration in blood plasma is the parathyroid hormone. A low level of calcium ions in the blood plasma promotes the release of more parathyroid hormone, which stimulates osteoclasts in bone tissue to release calcium and phosphate from the bone extracellular matrix. Thus, parathyroid hormone increases bone reabsorption. Parathyroid hormone also enhances the reabsorption of calcium ions from glomerular filtrate through renal tubule cells and back into the blood, and this increases the production of calcitrol, which is the active form of vitamin D. Moving on to the next slide, in adults, about 54% of the total body magnesium is part of the bone matrix as magnesium salts. Then the remaining 46% occur as magnesium ions. In the intracellular fluid, about 45% of these magnesium ions are found, and in the extracellular fluid, the remaining 1% of them are found. Magnesium ions are the second most common intracellular cation. Functionally, magnesium ions are a cofactor for certain enzymes needed for the metabolism of carbohydrates and proteins and for the sodium-potassium pump. Magnesium ions are essential for normal neuromuscular activity, synaptic transmission, and myocardial functioning. In addition, the secretion of parathyroid hormone depends on magnesium ions. And this brings us to table 27.2 on page 1097. So this table summarizes the blood electrolyte imbalances that can be found in the body. So please review this table on your own time. Moving on to slide 2 of 6. Moving on to slide 3 of 6. Moving on to slide 4 of 6. Moving on to slide 5 of 6. And moving on to slide 6 of 6. There's much good information in this table. Please make sure that you review it. Moving on to acid-base balance. This starts on page 1098 of your book. In a healthy person, several mechanisms help maintain the pH of the systemic arterial blood between 7.3 and 7.45. Because metabolic reactions often produce a huge excess of hydrogen ions, the lack of any mechanism for the disposal of hydrogen ions would cause hydrogen ions in the body fluids to rise quickly to a lethal level. Homeostasis of hydrogen ion concentration within a narrow range is thus essential for survival. The removal of hydrogen ions from body fluids and its subsequent elimination from the body depend on the following 3 major mechanisms. One is buffer systems. Buffers act quickly to temporarily bind hydrogen ions, removing the highly reactive excess hydrogen ions from solution. Buffering thus raises the pH of body fluids, but do not remove the hydrogen ions from the body. The second major mechanism for this homeostasis is the exhalation of carbon dioxide. By increasing the rate and depth of breathing, more carbon dioxide can be exhaled. Within minutes, this reduces the level of carbonic acid in the blood, which raises the blood pH, and therefore reduces the blood hydrogen ion level. And then thirdly, we have the kidney excretion of hydrogen ions. This is by far the slowest of the 3 mechanisms, but the excretion of urine is the only way to decisively eliminate acids from the body other than carbonic acid. Moving on to the next slide. Buffer systems include the protein buffer system, and this is the most abundant buffer in the intracellular fluid and the blood plasma. For example, the protein hemoglobin is an especially good buffer within red blood cells, and albumin is the main protein buffer in plasma. Proteins are composed of amino acids, organic molecules that contain at least one carboxyl group and at least one amino group. These groups are the functional component of the protein buffer system. The carboxyl group at one end of the protein acts like an acid by releasing hydrogen ions when pH level rises, and it dissociates in the following way. And this chemical equation is there on page 1098 for you to view in your book. So when it dissociates, the hydrogen ion is then able to react with any excess hydroxyl ions in the solution to form water. Moving on to the next slide. This equation is also on page 1098 of your book. The free amino group at the other end of the protein can act as a base by combining with hydrogen ions when the pH falls as follows. Therefore, proteins can buffer both acids and bases. Moving on to the next slide. As we have already noted, the protein hemoglobin is an important buffer of hydrogen ions in red blood cells. As blood flows through the systemic capillaries, carbon dioxide passes from tissue cells into red blood cells, where it combines with water to form carbonic acid. Once formed, carbonic acid dissociates into a hydrogen ion and a bicarbonate ion. At the same time that CO2 is entering red blood cells, oxyhemoglobin is giving up its oxygen to tissue cells. Reduced hemoglobin picks up most of the hydrogen ions. For this reason, reduced hemoglobin is usually written as Hb-H. The following reactions summarize these relationships. These reactions are also on page 1098 of your book. Moving on to the next slide. The carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system is based on the bicarbonate ion, which can act as a weak base, and carbonic acid, which can act as a weak acid. As you have already learned, bicarbonate ions are a sufficient anion in both intracellular and extracellular fluids. Because the kidneys also synthesize new bicarbonate ions and reabsorb filtered bicarbonate ions, this important buffer is not lost in the urine. If there is an excess of hydrogen ions, the bicarbonate ion can function as a weak base and remove the excess hydrogen ions as followed. And this reaction is on page 1099 of your book. Then, carbonic acid dissociates into water and carbon dioxide, and the carbon dioxide is exhaled from the lungs. Moving on to the next slide. Conversely, if there is a shortage of hydrogen ions, the carbonic acid can function as a weak acid and provide hydrogen ions as followed. This reaction is also on page 1099 of your book. Because carbon dioxide and water combine to form carbonic acid, this buffer system cannot protect against pH changes due to respiratory problems in which there is an excess or shortage of carbon dioxide. Moving on to the next slide, the phosphate buffer system acts via a mechanism similar to the one for the carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system. The components of the phosphate buffer system are the ions dihydrogen phosphate and monohydrogen phosphate. Recall that phosphates are major anions in the intracellular fluid and minor ones in the extracellular fluid. The dihydrogen phosphate ion acts as a weak acid and is capable of buffering strong bases such as hydroxyl ions. And you can also see this reaction on page 1099 of your book. On the other hand, the monohydrogen phosphate ion is capable of buffering the hydrogen ion released by a strong acid such as hydrochloric acid by acting as a weak base. And this reaction is also on page 1099 of your book. Because the concentration of phosphates is higher in the intracellular fluid, the phosphate buffer system is an important regulator of the pH in the cytosol. It acts to a small degree in the extracellular fluids and buffers acid in urine. Moving on to the next slide, the simple act of breathing also plays an important role in maintaining the pH of body fluids. An increase in the carbon dioxide concentration in body fluids increases the hydrogen ion concentration and thus lowers the pH. In other words, it makes your body fluids more acidic. Because carbonic acid can be eliminated by exhaling carbon dioxide, it is called a volatile acid. Conversely, a decrease in the carbon dioxide concentration of bodily fluids raises the pH. In other words, it makes your body fluids more alkaline. And this chemical interaction is illustrated in the following reversible reaction. And you can see this also on page 1099 of your book. Changes in the rate and depth of breathing can alter the pH of body fluids within a couple of minutes. With increased breathing, more carbon dioxide is inhaled. When carbon dioxide levels decrease, the reaction is driven to the left and hydrogen ion concentration falls and blood pH increases. On the other hand, if breathing is slower than normal, less carbon dioxide is exhaled. When carbon dioxide levels increase, the reaction is driven to the right of this reaction and the hydrogen ion concentration increases and blood pH decreases. And this brings us to page 1100. This is figure 27.9, and it shows the negative feedback loop for the regulation of blood pH by the respiratory system. So the exhalation of carbon dioxide lowers the hydrogen ion concentration of the blood. Moving on to the next slide, metabolic reactions produce non-volatile acids such as sulfuric acid. The only way for the body to get rid of all of the non-volatile acids it creates is to eliminate them with the excretion of urine. The proximal convoluted tubules and the collecting ducts of the kidneys secrete hydrogen ions into the tubular fluid. Moving on to the next slide, this cartoon is figure 27.10 on page 1101. So urine can be up to 1,000 times more acidic than blood due to the operation of proton pumps in the collecting ducts of the kidneys. These next two slides deal with the secretion of hydrogen ions by intercalated cells into the collecting duct. The intercalated cells are very important for the regulation of pH of body fluids. The apical membranes of some intercalated cells include proton pumps that secrete hydrogen ions into the tubule fluid, and we see that here at letter A. Moving on to letter B, we see how urine can be buffered with protein buffers or with dihydrogen phosphate. And this brings us to table 27.3 on page 1101, and this outlines the mechanisms that help to maintain the pH of body fluids. So please review this table on your own time. There's some very useful information in it. Moving on to acid-base imbalances, this begins on page 1100 of your book. Acidosis is a condition in which the blood pH is below 7.35, and alkalosis is a condition where the blood pH is higher than 7.45. The major physiological effect of acidosis is depression of the central nervous system through the depression of synaptic transmission. If the systemic arterial blood pH falls below 7, depression of the nervous system is so severe that the individual becomes disoriented, then comatose, and then may die. Patients with severe acidosis usually die when in a coma. A major physiological effect of alkalosis, by contrast, is the overexcitability in both the central nervous system and the peripheral nerves. Neurons conduct impulses repetitively, even when not stimulated by normal stimuli. The results are nervousness, muscle spasms, and even convulsions and death. Concerning respiratory acidosis, this is where there is an abnormally high partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the systemic arterial blood. Inadequate exhalation of carbon dioxide causes the blood pH to drop. Any condition that decreases the movement of carbon dioxide from the blood to the pulmonary alveoli of the lungs to the atmosphere causes a buildup of carbon dioxide, carbonic acid, and hydrogen ions. Such conditions include emphysema, pulmonary edema, injury to the respiratory center of the medulla oblongata, airway obstruction, or disorders of the muscles involved in breathing. In respiratory alkalosis, systemic arterial blood partial pressure of carbon dioxide falls below 35 millimeters of mercury. The cause of the drop in the partial pressure of carbon dioxide and the resulting increase in pH is hyperventilation, which occurs in conditions that stimulate the dorsal respiratory group of the brainstem. Such conditions include oxygen deficiency due to high altitude or pulmonary disease, stroke, or severe anxiety. In metabolic acidosis, the systemic arterial blood bicarbonate level drops. The decline in this important buffer causes the blood pH to decrease. Three situations may lower the blood level of the bicarbonate ions, such as the actual loss of bicarbonate ions, such as may occur with severe diarrhea or renal dysfunction, the accumulation of acid other than carbonic acid, as may occur in ketosis, or the failure of the kidneys to excrete hydrogen ions from metabolism of dietary proteins. If the problem is not too severe, hyperventilation can help bring blood pH back into the normal range. Ketosis is a metabolic state that occurs when your body burns fat for energy instead of glucose. And in metabolic alkalosis, the systemic arterial blood bicarbonate ion concentration rises. A non-respiratory loss of acid or an excessive intake of alkaline drugs causes the blood pH to increase to above 7.45. Excessive vomiting of gastric contents, which results in the substantial loss of hydrochloric acid, is probably the most frequent cause of metabolic alkalosis. Other causes can include gastric suctioning, the use of certain diuretics, endocrine disorders, excessive intake of alkaline drugs like antacids, and severe dehydration. Respiratory compensation through hypoventilation may bring the blood pH into a normal range. And this brings us to the next slide, which deals with aging and fluid, electrolyte, and acid-base homeostasis. And this section begins on page 1103 of your book. There are significant differences between adults and infants, especially premature infants, with respect to fluid distribution, regulation of fluid, and electrolyte balance and acid-base homeostasis. Factors that can influence the distribution is the metabolic rate. The metabolic rate of infants is about double that of adults. This results in the production of more metabolic wastes and acid, which can lead to the development of acidosis in infants. Also, the functional development of the kidneys. Infant kidneys are only about half as efficient in concentrating urine as those of an adult. Functional development is not complete until close to the end of the first month after birth. As a result, the kidneys of newborns can neither concentrate urine nor rid the body of excess acids as efficiently as those of adults. Another factor is body surface area. The ratio of body surface area to body volume in infants is about 3 times greater than that of adults. Water loss through the skin is significantly higher in infants than adults. Breathing rate. The higher breathing rate of infants causes greater water loss from the lungs. Respiratory alkalosis may occur because greater ventilation eliminates more carbon dioxide and lowers the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. Concerning ion concentrations, newborns have higher potassium ion and chloride ion concentrations than adults. This creates a tendency toward metabolic acidosis. In contrast with children and younger adults, older adults often have an impaired ability to maintain fluid, electrolyte, and acid-base homeostasis. With increasing age, many people have a decreased volume of intracellular fluid and decreased total body potassium ions due to the declining skeletal muscle mass and increasing mass of adipose tissue. Age-related decreases in respiratory and renal functioning may compromise the acid-base balance by slowing the exhalation of carbon dioxide and the excretion of excess acids in the urine. Other kidney changes, such as a decrease in blood flow, decrease in glomerular filtration rate, and a reduced sensitivity to antidiuretic hormone, have an adverse effect on the ability to maintain fluid and electrolyte balance. Due to a decrease in the number and efficiency of sweat glands, water loss from the skin declines with age. Because of these age-related changes, older adults are susceptible to several fluid and electrolyte disorders. Dehydration and hypernatremia often occur due to inadequate fluid intake or loss of more water than sodium ions in vomit, feces, or urine. Hyponatremia may occur due to an inadequate intake of sodium ions, elevated loss of sodium ions in the urine, vomit, or diarrhea, or an impaired ability of the kidneys to produce dilute urine. Hypokalemia often occurs in older adults who chronically use laxatives to relieve constipation or who take potassium ion depleting diuretic drugs for treatment of hypertension or heart disease. And acidosis may occur due to the impaired ability of the lungs and kidneys to compensate for acid-base imbalances. One cause of acidosis is the decreased production of ammonia by renal tubule cells, which is then not available to combine with hydrogen ions and be excreted in the urine as ammonium ions. Another cause is the reduced exhalation of carbon dioxide. And that concludes tonight's lecture.